We wish to address the recent publications by Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, Shumiral TV, and Sumando Voces concerning Kailasa and its diplomatic engagements. It is with profound concern that we observe these outlets simultaneously disseminating identical mischaracterizations despite readily available evidence to the contrary. Such coordinated dissemination of misinformation demands a formal response. We shall address each allegation systematically, with supporting documentation and reference to established international law in the interest of rectifying these serious misrepresentations. First, on the sovereignty and statehood. All four media outlets have characterized Kailasa as fictitious, demonstrating a concerning disregard for established principles of international law governing statehood. We respectfully direct your attention to the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, which establishes four criteria for statehood: permanent population, defined territory, government, and the capacity for international relations. Kailasa satisfies each of these criteria in accordance with international legal standards. Article 3 of this convention explicitly states the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. This is not a matter of interpretation, but precise language of binding international law. Multiple precedents exist for non-traditional sovereign entities, including the Holy See, the Vatican itself, which maintained sovereignty during the Agnon exile with only a papal residence. The Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which has functioned as a sovereign entity since 1798 despite territorial changes. The unequal application of these established standards to Kailasa represents a concerning departure from the principle of sovereign equality that underpins the international legal order. Addressing conservation partnerships, Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, Shumiral TV, Sumando Voces have mischaracterized legitimate conservation partnerships as fraudulent land acquisition. This characterization is factually incorrect and requires immediate clarification. These agreements are explicitly conservation partnerships between a US-based indigenous organization and indigenous Bolivian communities, focusing on environmental protection, preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, and sustainable development. The agreements explicitly respect indigenous ownership and sovereignty. These partnerships comply fully with Bolivian law number 465 and the ILO Convention 169. Furthermore, they operate within the framework of the Bolivian Constitution, specifically Article 30(2)(4), which guarantees indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. We must emphasize the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory in these agreements. This factual error in your reporting constitutes a significant misrepresentation that requires correction. Our approach is rooted in collaborative research, strategic alliance building between indigenous traditions. We share a profound reverence for nature and commit to non-exploitative practices in all our endeavors. Our methodology begins with deep listening, learning about community cultures, specific needs, mortality rates, health concerns, and inherent strengths. As indigenous peoples ourselves, preserving knowledge and cultural heritage remains our highest priority. We leverage appropriate technology, AI resources, and communication platforms to ensure communities have both a voice and outlet for cultural preservation. Our partnerships are designed to amplify indigenous perspectives and create a sustainable pathway for traditional knowledge to thrive in contemporary contexts such as social media and both in physical and digital archiving. We want to next address financial agreements. Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, Shumiral TV, and Sumanda Voces have mischaracterized the financial components of these conservation partnerships as exploitation. This characterization fundamentally misunderstands indigenous economic relationships and requires a correction. The financial components of these agreements represent investments in community development, environmental protection, and cultural preservation to be managed by the communities themselves according to their own governance structures. Indigenous communities exercise their constitutional right to self-determination in determining the appropriate value of these partnerships. The suggestion that indigenous leaders cannot determine fair value for their communities contradicts the principle of indigenous autonomy recognized in international law. We note with this concern the selective application of financial scrutiny to these transparent, consensual agreements, while similar scrutiny is notably absent regarding extractive industries operating in indigenous territories. Next, we'll address indigenous sovereignty. The allegation that these partnerships violate indigenous sovereignty constitute a fundamental misunderstanding of both the partnerships themselves and the concept of indigenous sovereignty. These agreements explicitly honor indigenous sovereignty, with all documents containing provisions that recognize and respect indigenous autonomy, governance structures, and decision-making processes. All negotiations were conducted transparently, with full documentation, translation into local languages, and the presence of community witnesses and leaders throughout the process. Article 36 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples specifically ensures Indigenous peoples' right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation with all own members as well as others across borders. The characterization of such cooperative relationships as violations directly undermines the internationally recognized indigenous rights. Next, the leadership credibility. Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, Sumanda Voces, and Shumiral TV have made allegations regarding the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism while omitting judicial determinations that directly contradict these characterizations. We respectfully direct your attention to the following court decisions. On February 2nd, 2024, Gujarat High Court in case number RSCR A9973 2019 completely exonerated the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, with the court directly verifying the well-being and the freedom of the individuals involved. The United States District Court, Southern District of Ohio, case number 213 CV 00526, ruled in favor of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and imposed substantial penalties on the complainant for defamation. And the Karnataka High Court in 2012, order number CRLP 3254-2012, declared the arrest illegal without authority, contrary to law, and without jurisdiction. The continued promotion of allegations explicitly rejected by courts across multiple jurisdictions represents a concerning departure from journalistic standards of accuracy and fairness. On the indigenous rejection claims, all four media houses have stated that indigenous communities reject agreements with Kailasa. This claim warrants scrutiny. We respectfully request documentation of any community-wide decision-making process in accordance with traditional governance structures that resulted in such rejection. The absence of such documentation raises significant concerns about the factual basis of this claim. We note with concern reports from indigenous communities that there was external pressure applied from media misrepresentation to terminate partnerships freely entered into through their constitutional right to self-determination. Such interference in indigenous decision-making processes contradicts the principle of indigenous autonomy enshrined in both Bolivian constitutional law and international human rights frameworks. Next, on the diplomatic engagement. All four media houses have characterized and said the standard diplomatic protocol as improper or controversial. This characterization misunderstands fundamental diplomatic practice. Diplomatic representatives routinely engage with government officials as a standard function of international relations. This practice is universal among sovereign entities and international organizations. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not directly involved in these diplomatic initiatives. These are independent actions by US-based organizations with appropriate diplomatic credentials. The selective application of scrutiny to these standard diplomatic practices when conducted by indigenous representatives raises concerns about equitable treatment in international engagement. On environmental protection, Shumiral TV and Sumanda Voces have characterized conservation partnerships as environmental exploitation. This characterization inverts the fundamental process of these agreements. These partnerships are explicitly designed for environmental protection, focusing on preserving biodiversity, maintaining forest integrity, and supporting sustainable indigenous management practices in accordance to both traditional knowledge and contemporary conservation science. All agreements include provisions for ecological conservation and sustainable resource management. The economic components fund environmental protection, not resource extraction. We note with concern the absence of similar scrutiny regarding extractive industries operating in indigenous territories, which raises questions about the consistent application of environmental concerns. On international representation, Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, and Sumanda Voces have alleged false representation at international forums. This characterization misunderstands the established UN participation protocols. Representatives from Kailasa have participated in UN forums following the established protocols for civil society and indigenous representation that apply equally to all participants. The United Nations has established and published multiple reports documenting the concerns raised by these representatives. The suggestion that such participation constitutes misrepresentation would logically apply to all similar participation by civil society organizations, yet it is selectively applied only to Kailasa's representatives. This selective application of scrutiny raises concerns about equitable access to international forums designed specifically to include diverse voices. On documentation in economic systems, Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, and Sumanda Voces have made allegations regarding documentation and economic systems that require factual correction. All diplomatic documents issued by Kailasa are legitimate, properly authorized, and follow standard diplomatic protocols. No specific evidence of any forgery has been presented because none exists. The development of economic systems appropriate to the needs of a sovereign entity is a fundamental aspect of sovereignty, not a suspicious activity. Indigenous communities worldwide have developed alternative economic systems to overcome exclusion from mainstream financial structures. The selective application of scrutiny to Kailasa's economic sovereignty, while similar practices by other sovereign entities receive no such scrutiny, represents an inconsistent standard of evaluation. On governance structures and territorial presence, Revista Crisis, Sumanda Voces, and RTP Bolivia have made allegations regarding governance structures and territorial presence that warrant correction. All engagement with indigenous communities occurs through their legitimate governance structures with full respect for traditional decision-making. Any institutional support is provided at the explicit request of indigenous communities exercising their constitutional right to self-governance. All visits within indigenous territories occur with explicit invitation from legitimate indigenous authorities exercising their constitutional right to welcome guests onto their sovereign lands. Article 32(4) of Bolivian Constitution guarantees indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. which includes determining who may enter their territories. The suggestion that indigenous communities require external authorization to develop their institutions or welcome visitors contradicts the principle of indigenous sovereignty recognized both in Bolivian constitution law and international human rights frameworks. Finally, in conclusion, Kailasa respectfully urges Revista Crisis, RTP Bolivia, Shumiral TV and Sumanda Voces to review their reporting in the light of the factual corrections provided herein. The coordinated dissemination of identical mischaracterizations across multiple outlets raises significant concerns about the independent verification of facts and adherence to journalistic standards of accuracy, fairness, and balance. We respectfully request that these outlets publish corrections to these factual errors in accordance with journalistic ethics and the public's right to accurate information. Kailasa remains committed to transparent engagement with media organizations that adhere to established journalistic practices and standards. We stand ready to provide additional documentation, clarification, or interviews to facilitate accurate reporting on these matters. The principle of indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and equitable participation in international governance are not only mere matters of policy preference, but fundamental rights recognized in international law. Their protection and advancement should be a concern to all who value human dignity and justice. Thank you for your attention on these matters of significant importance. Nithyananda.
New Ekin Moisturizer, cooling jelly texture for stronger skin barrier. Buy Ekin now.